The air in the high-ceilinged war room was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of aging leather, a grim counterpoint to the ecstatic cheers ringing through the rest of the capital. Marshal Rodion Malinowski, the Minister of Defense, leaned back from the massive mahogany table, a smirk playing on his lips as he flicked ash into a crystal tray. The news had just broken. Sputnik was in orbit. "Comrades," he rumbled, his voice cutting through the quiet buzz of aides shuffling documents. "The Americans are chasing geese. While their Hollywood directors worry about Elvis, we have put a moon over their silly little continent. The Yankee arrogance, it cracks like ice." Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, nodded in agreement, but his eyes held a sliver of professional skepticism. He ran a finger down the spine of a classified American intelligence report, a report detailing the terrifying, relentless focus of the U.S. on strategic nuclear deterrence. Malinowski's victory lap was premature. "The satellite is an exclamation point. Marshal," Gorshkov corrected, his tone cool and precise. "But the Americans have not stopped building the hammer. Their Strategic Air Command, SAC, flies 24 hours a day. B-52s, bearing the Mark 39 thermonuclear warheads, are always on approach routes. The bomber gap is their propaganda, but the threat is real." The Marshal waved a dismissive hand. "The bombers are fat targets, Sergei. Slow, predictable. We are building the V-series of aircraft, yes, but more importantly, we have the R-7 Semyorka, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM. It is physics, not aviation. It travels from our launch pads in the Urals over the pole, and bang, Washington, D.C. disappears before their own radar can compute the trajectory." He tapped the table. "They have nothing that can truly reach us with that speed and certainty." This was the central, terrifying calculus of the late 1950s. The Soviet Union believed it had achieved first strike capability, the ability to launch a nuclear attack so devastating and swift that the enemy's ability to retaliate, second strike capability, would be utterly crippled, saving the Soviet Union from total annihilation. The ICBM, a miracle of Soviet rocketry, made their military installations virtually untouchable. They could hide their missile silos deep in the colossal, impenetrable heartland. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the frantic, brightly lit war rooms of the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy stared at the same brutal mathematics. The U.S. relied on a triad: bombers, land-based missiles, and, eventually, submarine-launched missiles. But the first two legs were wobbly. The Soviet ICBM program meant every SAC airbase and every new Atlas or Titan missile silo was an easy, fixed target. In a sudden attack, the U.S. might lose 90% of its nuclear payload before it could even leave the ground. The Soviets could always hit the U.S. first, and the U.S. might be left without the ability to inflict an unacceptable penalty on Moscow, the whole point of deterrence. The Americans needed an invisible weapon, an utterly undetectable platform that could survive the first strike and guarantee the second. They needed a missile small enough to be launched from a tube, and a submarine silent enough to hide in the oceanic blackness. This desperate requirement converged on a single, highly classified project, Polaris. Its existence was still only a whisper in the Soviet naval academies, dismissed as another piece of fanciful American engineering. Gorshkov's gaze returned to the U.S. report, specifically a small footnote mentioning a solid propellant FBM. FBM, Fleet Ballistic Missile. The concept was crude, the initial design small, almost toy-like compared to the behemoth Soviet Project 658, Hotel-class, submarines carrying massive, liquid-fueled rockets. The Soviet admirals, focused on their heavy, impressive hardware, laughed at the idea of a tiny American rocket. They couldn't yet grasp that the size, in this case, was the point, and the silence of the launch platform would rewrite the rules of war. 1958, Electric Boat Shipyard, Groton, Connecticut. The smell of ozone, welding slag, and brine hung over the massive construction bay where the first hull section of the USS George Washington was taking shape. It was a chaotic, around-the-clock crucible of innovation. The George Washington was not designed for speed, not designed for combat with other subs, and certainly not designed for comfort. It was a vessel of pure, existential desperation, a mobile, submerged launch pad. The core challenge was integrating a powerful nuclear missile into a submarine hull that was already complex enough to contain a nuclear reactor, a crew of over 100 men, and enough food to keep them submerged for months. The original plans, spearheaded by Vice Admiral William Rayburn Jr. and his Special Projects Office, called for adapting the massive Jupiter liquid-fueled missile. It was a technical and logistical nightmare. The Jupiter was corrosive, volatile, and required a complex, hours-long fueling procedure. Launching it from a rolling, submerged platform was simply suicidal. Rayburn, a man known for his relentless drive and ability to cut through bureaucratic cement, demanded a radical pivot. He needed a solid fuel rocket. Solid fuel, a propellant that burned like a giant, controlled firecracker, was stable, required no fueling at sea, and could be fired in minutes. It was, in the words of one engineer, an A-bomb on a stick, ready to go the instant the launch order came through. This missile was the UGM-27 Polaris. But solid fuel came with a brutal trade-off: reduced range. The initial Polaris, one missile, had a range of only 1,200 nautical miles. This was the geometry that kept the project's critics, especially in the Soviet Union, in dismissive spirits. A Polaris sub, to hit Moscow, will have to sneak deep into the heavily defended Soviet European littoral, the Norwegian Sea, perhaps the Barents, an area where Soviet anti-submarine warfare, ASW, patrols, air cover, and mines were thick as northern fog. It looked like an expensive, risky tactical weapon, not a strategic, game-changing deterrent. Yet, the George Washington was a marvel of stealth engineering. Its S-5W pressurized water reactor provided virtually unlimited range, allowing it to traverse the globe without surfacing. More importantly, engineers focused obsessively on silencing. The vessel was sheathed in an anechoic coating to absorb active sonar pings. The massive internal machinery, turbines, pumps, gears, was mounted on giant, shock-absorbing rafts to dampen vibration, turning the terrifying noise of a nuclear submarine into a faint acoustic whisper, barely detectable above the natural oceanic background noise. The goal was to make it virtually invisible to the hydrophones of Soviet listening posts. In the shipyards, Lieutenant Commander James B. Mo Osborne oversaw the integration of the 16 massive missile tubes into the hull section just behind the conning tower. Each tube, 18 feet high, was a commitment to the mission. 16 missiles, each carrying a 600-kiloton thermonuclear warhead. The entire ship, with its 16 missiles, represented a counterpunch capable of leveling nearly 20 major Soviet cities, enough to guarantee the destruction of the Soviet state. Osborne, wiping sweat from his brow, knew the range limitation was severe. Their initial patrol zones were predetermined: the vast, deep, open North Atlantic, safely outside the immediate kill zones of the Soviet Northern Fleet. But the engineers were already working on the next iteration, Polaris A2, with an extended range that would push their operational waters further south, into areas less aggressively patrolled. The U.S. Navy wasn't just building a submarine, it was building a strategic doctrine. A doctrine where deterrence was no longer about winning a nuclear war, but about preventing one. It was the principle of mutually assured destruction, MAD, given physical form. The vessel's ability to remain hidden was its true weapon. If the Soviet Union couldn't find the missile launch platforms, they couldn't possibly execute a successful first strike. And the moment the Kremlin understood that, the terrifying symmetry of the Cold War would shift forever. November 15, 1960. Holy Loch, Scotland and the North Atlantic Deep. The dockyard at Holy Loch was a hive of activity, masked by the constant, damp Scottish mist. This was to be the forward base for the new American Fleet Ballistic Missile, FBM, submarines, a crucial strategic outpost that allowed the vessels to spend less time transiting and more time on station. The USS George Washington, SSBN 598, prepared for its first deterrent patrol. Aboard the vessel, in the cramped confines of the control room, Captain James B. Osborne, the Gold Crew commander, felt the immense weight of history settle on his shoulders. This was not a training exercise. This was the opening move in a global game of existential hide-and-seek. The George Washington was loaded with 16 UGM, 27 Polaris 1 missiles, live and armed. Her mission, to disappear beneath the waves for 60 days and remain ready to launch a retaliatory strike instantly. All ahead 2/3, Osborne commanded quietly, the order relayed through the ship's internal speakers. The massive vessel, 380 feet long, slid silently away from the pier. As the depth gauges clicked past 200 feet, the pressure hull groaned a little, a living organism adjusting to its deep-sea environment. Then silence. The careful engineering had paid off. Below the surface, the George Washington was acoustically almost invisible, a true ghost in the machine of the ocean. For the next 2 months, the sub patrolled a vast, pre-assigned area of the North Atlantic. The crew worked a rigorous schedule: maintenance, drills, and the chilling, ever-present readiness for the launch order. The navigation was painstaking, relying on the sophisticated ship's inertial navigation system, SINS, a complex set of gyroscopes and accelerometers designed to track every minute movement without needing celestial fixes from a surface. Because if they surfaced to use a sextant, they risked detection. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet Navy was running frantic analyses. Admiral Gorshkov had received confirmation of the George Washington's deployment. The American press, though restricted in detail, had been loud about the new deterrent. Gorshkov ordered Operation Frantic, a massive, coordinated ASW effort involving trawlers, long-range patrol aircraft, and his newest Project 670 SCAT, Charlie-class attack submarines. The primary goal: locate and track this new type of American SSBN. The Soviet admirals still clung to their ingrained belief. The ocean was simply too large to hide a large metal object indefinitely. Their acoustic hydrophones, positioned along the JUK Gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, and their deep-sea listening arrays were powerful. They had detected the noisier American attack submarines, SSNs, frequently. They expected the Polaris boats to be merely less noisy. But the George Washington patrols passed with 0 confirmed sightings. No contact, no acoustic signature, no fleeting radar blip from a trailing Soviet vessel. The reports flowing back to Gorshkov were maddeningly blank. His ASW commanders, trained on the noise levels of World War II era diesel electrics, or even the early American SSNs, could not resolve the faint acoustic signature of the Polaris boat from the natural background of shrimp clicks, whale songs, and deep ocean currents. It was a failure of physics and technology, compounded by doctrinal disbelief. The Soviets continued to hunt for the source of the patrols, the single, fixed point of the sub. They looked for bubbles, for anomalous temperature changes, for the distinct clunk of missile tube operation. They were looking for a battleship under the water, not an acoustic phantom. The completion of that first patrol, with the George Washington returning unscathed and completely undetected, sent the first palpable tremors through the Soviet military establishment. The missile itself was secondary. The platform, the vessel that could disappear for 60 days and return to base without having been tracked once, was the strategic revolution. The United States had established its unassailable second strike capability. The first strike now became strategically worthless, because the second strike was guaranteed to follow. The Kremlin's laughter was beginning to die in their throats. 1962. The Caspian Sea, Soviet Union, and the Atlantic undercurrents. The failure of Operation Frantic led to a brutal, self-critical restructuring within the Soviet Navy. Admiral Gorshkov faced political pressure, but he was also a realist. He knew the Americans had achieved something profoundly threatening. The focus shifted immediately from detecting the subs to killing them. This necessitated a massive, expensive overhaul of Soviet anti-submarine warfare, ASW, doctrine, ships, and aircraft. But it would take years. In the meantime, the Americans were not resting on their laurels. The initial Polaris A-1 missile, with its 1,200 nautical mile range, had required the SSBNs to operate relatively close to Europe. Now, the Polaris A-2 was entering service. It boasted a crucial extension, a range of 1,500 nautical miles, achieved through the addition of a second-stage motor made of a lighter fiberglass casing. This seemingly small increase in range had gigantic strategic implications. It meant the SSBNs could now operate further west into the mid-Atlantic and the deep basins of the Mediterranean, vast, deep, and acoustically complex operational areas that were far outside the immediate patrol routes of the Soviet Northern and Black Sea fleets. The patrol area had just quadrupled in size, diluting Soviet SW resources to the point of irrelevance. In the Soviet Union, the military leadership was finally understanding the true implications of the Polaris system. It was not simply a submarine, but a guaranteed, mobile ICBM platform. General Vladimir Tolubko, a key figure in Soviet strategic rocket forces, presented a sobering analysis to the Politburo in early 1962. Comrades, Tolubko declared, projecting a grainy map onto the wall of the war room. The problem is not the missile. The problem is the ocean. We control the land. The Americans hide in the water. We can kill their silos. We can burn their bases. But we cannot burn the Atlantic. We have invested billions into the fixed silos of the R-16 and the R-7. He pointed to the deep, secure heartland on the map. These are safe from the B-52s, but they are not safe from Polaris. He then highlighted a new, chilling point. The range of the A-2 missile meant that Polaris submarines operating south of the Azores, or even in the Norwegian Sea far from the Soviet coast, could now strike targets deep within the RSFSR, Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Specifically, the Soviet command structures, missile manufacturing plants, and crucial command and control centers around the Volga region, previously considered invulnerable, were now within the missile's arc. But there was a more profound realization, one that caused the greatest alarm within the Kremlin. The U.S. SSBN fleet was growing. USS Patrick Henry, USS Theodore Roosevelt, USS Robert E. Lee. The boats were sliding out of the shipyards in rapid succession, creating a permanent submerged presence. At any given moment, the U.S. Navy guaranteed that at least 5 or 6 SSBNs were on station, armed and ready. That meant 80 to 96 nuclear warheads were constantly circling the Eurasian landmass, ready for launch on a moment's notice. The fixed geometry of land-based deterrence had been irrevocably broken by the fluid reality of the sea. The Soviet Union could launch its entire arsenal and destroy every American ICBM and bomber. But the Polaris subs would simply wait, hidden in the blackness, and then unleash a full retaliatory strike that would decimate the Soviet command structure and infrastructure. It was this realization that triggered the most audacious and dangerous gambit of the Cold War. If the U.S. could launch missiles from the periphery, and those missiles could strike the Soviet heartland, then the Soviet Union needed its own launch platforms deep within the American sphere of influence to restore the balance. The search for a place to put their own missiles, close to the American mainland, but far from Soviet shores, was already underway. The focus shifted, inevitably, to the one place the U.S. could not easily control: Cuba. The Polaris SSBN force, by guaranteeing the American second strike, had inadvertently set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962. The Caribbean Sea and the Oval Office, Washington, D.C. The pressure exerted by the silent Polaris fleet directly birthed Project Inadir, the Soviet plan to secretly deploy intermediate-range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, to Fidel Castro's Cuba. The Soviet leadership, led by Nikita Khrushchev, viewed the Polaris as a fundamental insult to Soviet strategic security, a constant dagger aimed at Moscow. If the Americans could hold Soviet cities hostage from the Atlantic, the Soviets would hold American cities hostage from the Caribbean. In the waters surrounding Cuba, the U.S. Navy, including the very SSBNs that had caused this crisis, operated with a chilling sense of purpose. The George Washington-class boats were deployed to their pre-assigned stations, ensuring that regardless of the outcome of the land-based confrontation, the submerged second strike remained intact. Captain William Mickey Finn, commanding the USS Robert E. SSBN 601, maintained patrol off the coast of Spain, adhering to the stringent rules of engagement. RO. His 16 Polaris A-2 missiles were aimed at designated Soviet targets, awaiting the coded launch order that everyone prayed would never come. The nuclear deterrent had become the ultimate paradox. Its purpose was not to be used, but to exist. The Soviet response to the Polaris threat was also visible in the deployment of its own submarines to Cuban waters. These were not SSBNs. The Soviet missile subs were still too noisy and too reliant on liquid fuel to be deployed for long, silent deterrent patrols. Instead, they sent 4 diesel-electric Project 641 Foxtrot attack submarines, each armed with a single, crucial nuclear torpedo. Their mission was tactical defense, not strategic deterrence. They were sent to counter the massive U.S. conventional forces massing around the island. On October 27th, known to history as Black Saturday, the tension peaked. A U.S. Navy ASW destroyer, the USS Coney, detected the B-59 Foxtrot submarine deep underwater near the quarantine line. For hours, the Coney dropped small, non-lethal practice depth charges, signal charges meant to force the sub to the surface for identification. Aboard the B-59, stifling heat and carbon dioxide levels had rendered the crew near exhausted. Captain Valentin Savitsky, believing the ship was under real attack and out of communication with Moscow, ordered the assembly of a nuclear torpedo. "Perhaps the war has already started up there," Savitsky reportedly exclaimed in the suffocating control room. "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink all their ships." The moment was averted only by the intervention of Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff aboard the B-59, who was required to approve the nuclear launch. Arkhipov, rational and calm despite the unbearable pressure, successfully argued for surfacing the sub. Had that nuclear torpedo been launched, the resulting explosion would have sunk the Coney and triggered an immediate, full-scale conventional and likely nuclear U.S. response. The fact was, the Soviets didn't need to put land-based missiles in Cuba if they had a truly survivable sea-based deterrent like Polaris. The crisis exposed the fundamental weakness of the Soviet strategic position. Their missile submarines, the Hotel class, though impressive in size, were loud and had to surface to fire their liquid-fueled missiles, making them vulnerable and failing to provide a true, hidden second-strike capability. They were a first-strike weapon platform, reliant on winning the war quickly, not deterring it through survivability. The resolution of the crisis saw the Soviets agree to remove their missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the U.S. publicly agreed not to invade the island and secretly agreed to remove its outdated Jupiter IRBMs from Turkey. But the true underlying strategic driver, the Polaris SSBN force, remained untouched, invisible, and unnegotiable. It was the silent victor of the Cuban Missile Crisis, having forced Khrushchev's dangerous hand and proven the superiority of a U.S. second strike strategy. 1964, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C., and the Murmansk shipyards, Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. SSBN program transitioned from an experimental, urgent project into the centerpiece of American strategic deterrence. The concept was codified. The SSBNs would be the invulnerable arsenal. If a Soviet warhead struck America, the Polaris submarines were the guaranteed instruments of the nation's final, devastating reply. By 1964, the U.S. had commissioned several new boats, including the Lafayette class, which were even quieter and more acoustically refined than the initial George Washington class. Crucially, these new boats carried the Polaris A-3 missile. This was another massive leap in capability. The A-3 had a range of 2,500 nautical miles, a full 1,000 miles further than the A-1. This increased range did more than just expand the patrol zones. It fundamentally altered the targeting strategy. A Polaris SSBN operating deep in the North Atlantic could now strike targets across the entire Soviet Union, including the most vital, politically sensitive targets: Moscow, Leningrad, and the strategic command bunkers deep in the Urals. The A-3 also introduced another critical feature: multiple reentry vehicles, MRVs. Each A-3 missile carried 3 smaller warheads, instead of a single large one. While they couldn't be independently targeted like true multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs, they separated upon reentry, showering 3 distinct targets in a tight pattern. This meant that a single SSBN with 16 missiles could now rain down 48 warheads on Soviet territory. In the Pentagon's deepest vaults, the single integrated operational plan, SJOP, was constantly updated. The Polaris targets were designated as high priority, specifically the Soviet leadership bunkers, command and control centers, and fixed ICBM silos. The strategy was clear: hit the enemy's head and their ability to command their remaining forces. This realization, that a handful of American tiny submarines, once dismissed by the Kremlin, could annihilate the entire Soviet governing structure, was chilling to Admiral Gorshkov. He saw the numbers. The U.S. was committed to a fleet of 41 SSBNs by the end of the decade, guaranteeing continuous global coverage. In the Murmansk shipyards, the Soviet Union was scrambling to catch up, but they faced crippling technological hurdles. Their first-generation SSBNs, like the Hotel class, Project 658, used liquid-fueled R-13 missiles that were massive, dangerous to handle, and required the submarine to surface to launch. The American ability to launch the solid-fueled Polaris from deep below the surface was the key strategic difference. The Soviets rapidly developed the Project 667A Navaga, Yankee class, SSBNs, explicitly designed as a counter-Polaris measure. The Yankees were larger, intended to carry 16 missiles like their American counterparts. Crucially, their new missile, the R-27 SSN-6, was finally a submarine-launched, storable liquid-fueled rocket that could be fired while submerged. It was a step forward, but the system remained less responsive and inherently more complex and dangerous than the American solid-fuel technology. More importantly, the Yankee class was still considerably noisier than the U.S. Lafayette class. The Soviet focus on brute size and speed had meant less dedication to acoustic dampening. U.S. attack submarines, often patrolling near the Soviet bastions, frequently and easily tracked the Soviet SSBNs. The irony was devastating. The Soviets could find and track their own deterrent force, while the Americans remained ghosts. The fear in Moscow shifted from "can they hit us?" to "can we find their launch platforms before they destroy our command structure?" The answer, increasingly, was no. The Polaris force had achieved a state of strategic invulnerability that transformed the Cold War from a race for first strike superiority into a perpetual, nerve-wracking condition of mutually assured destruction. The SSBN patrols became the most dangerous, yet most stabilizing patrols in human history. 1967. Holy Loch, Scotland, and the North Sea Patrol. The routine at Holy Loch was a monotonous, yet highly efficient cycle of deterrence. A submarine would return from its 60 to 70-day patrol, dock alongside the massive tender ship, the USS Hunley or the USS Simon Lake, and swap out the crew. The gold crew would come ashore for rest and refitting, while the blue crew took the boat back out within days. This relentless operational tempo ensured that the required number of SSBNs remained on station at all times, invisible. The sheer psychological burden on the crews, the young officers and enlisted men locked away in the steel hull, was immense. They lived under the constant shadow of the world ending on their watch. Below decks, the missile compartment, designated with stark signage, held the 16 Polaris 3 missiles, each a tightly coiled spring of thermonuclear horror. Lieutenant Mark Collins, a navigating officer aboard the USS Tecumseh, SSBN 628, stared at the inertial navigation system readouts. His job was the most sensitive, keeping the boat's position accurate to within a few hundred feet over thousands of miles, deep underwater, necessary for the missile to hit its target thousands of miles away. The system, SINS, was temperamental, requiring constant calibration using occasional, risky periscope fixes on passing stars. A momentary, dangerous vulnerability. Collins walked through the narrow passageways, past the signs. If an emergency, the missile firing system could be operated locally by 2 authorized persons. The reality was that every man aboard was acutely aware that he was a potential executioner. The captain, receiving the authentication codes, the emergency action message, EM, would initiate the launch sequence, but the firing mechanism required multiple authorized personnel to turn keys and input codes simultaneously. It was a fail-safe against a single person's madness, but it meant the crew was collectively responsible for Armageddon. The patrols were characterized by long, unbroken silence. Communications were restricted to extremely low-frequency, ELF, radio transmissions, which were slow, difficult to decipher, but could penetrate seawater. The EMs would come through as encrypted bursts of static, containing pre-formatted messages and the codes for missile launch. A single EM could contain the death warrant for dozens of Soviet cities. In the mess hall, the atmosphere was generally jovial, a deliberate counterpoint to the mission's gravity. Movies were shown, coffee flowed endlessly, and poker games kept the minds busy. But the underlying mission was never forgotten. Drills were frequent, the captain testing the crew's readiness to receive and process a launch order. The phrase, "all hands man battle stations," missile firing drill, would send a chilling wave of focused energy through the boat. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence, operating out of their embassies and disguised fishing trawlers in the North Sea, was intensely focused on the comings and goings at Holy Loch. They charted the time-in/time out of the SSBNs, attempting to piece together the patrol rotation schedules. Their goal was simple: predict when a specific armed boat would be off station for maintenance, giving them a slight strategic window. They knew they could not find the subs while submerged. Their only hope was catching them at a fixed point. But the sheer flexibility and pace of the U.S. Navy's operation constantly defeated Soviet predictability models. The boats didn't keep a perfect schedule. Mechanical issues, weather, and deliberately misleading maneuvers ensured the Soviets could never pinpoint the exact number of warheads on station or their precise location. The Polaris subs, far from being just technological marvels, were floating psychological fortresses. They were the ultimate expression of the Cold War mindset, silent, invisible, and ready to inflict unimaginable destruction to ensure peace. The crews were the custodians of that paradox, living in a cramped, dark world where their success was measured entirely by their invisibility. 1969. The Barents Sea, Soviet Arctic Circle. The Soviet Union's answer to the Polaris dominance finally began to roll out from the massive, state-secret shipyards of Severodvinsk. This was the Project 667A Navaga, known to NATO as the Yankee-class SSBN. If Polaris was the symbol of the U.S. guaranteed second strike, the Yankee was the Soviet attempt to achieve the same balance. The first of the Yankee boats, armed with 16 submerged launch, liquid-fueled R-27 Cessna-6 missiles, represented a monumental technological and strategic shift for the Soviet Navy. They had finally abandoned the highly volatile, surfacing-to-launch requirement of their earlier boats. Admiral Gorshkov himself championed the program, recognizing that until the Soviet Union could hold American cities at continuous nuclear risk from the sea, the strategic balance would remain tilted dangerously in favor of Washington. However, the geographical realities imposed an inherent, fatal flaw on the Soviet deterrent. The Yankee subs were manufactured and home-ported deep within the Arctic Circle in the heavily defended Northern Fleet bastions near Murmansk. To reach their designated patrol zones off the U.S. East Coast, known as Yankee stations, they had to transit through the JUK Gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, or the narrow passages of the Norwegian Sea. These were choke points meticulously monitored by U.S. and NATO naval forces. The journey was a gauntlet. Commander Igor Vorobyov, captain of the new K, 219 Yankee-class SSBN felt a crushing anxiety every time his boat slipped beneath the icy waves to begin its long transit. His crew, meticulously trained and politically vetted, knew that the moment they left the protective shelf of the Soviet coast, they were in a hunter's field. U.S. Navy and RAF patrol aircraft flew constant anti-submarine warfare, ASW surveillance, dropping hydroacoustic buoys that listened for the telltale sounds of Soviet machinery. Below the surface, the American attack submarines, SSNs, the Thresher and later the Sturgeon classes, were constantly on the prowl. These American hunters were faster, could dive deeper, and were engineered for acoustic silence far superior to the Yankee class. The Soviet engineers had achieved parity in missile count, but not in stealth. Vorobyov spent his transit days in a perpetual state of acoustic vigilance. The Yankee boats, for all their power, were noisy. The roar of their turbines, the clatter of auxiliary pumps, and the grinding of their gearboxes provided a clear, discernible acoustic signature to the American hydrophones. An American SSN, lying silent in the deep sound channel, could often track a Yankee from dozens of miles away. The irony was acute. The American Polaris subs operated in the vast, deep, open ocean, practically invisible. The Soviet Yankee subs, their direct counterparts, were forced into an intense game of cat and mouse from the moment they left port, often shadowed by American SSNs for the entirety of their transit. This shadowing, or trailing, was a profound strategic failure. It meant that in the event of a nuclear exchange, the U.S. already knew the precise location of the Soviet deterrent force and could likely eliminate it before a launch could occur. The Soviet Navy was building a second strike capability that was fundamentally vulnerable. The Soviet admirals realized that while the Polaris SSBNs had created a true state of mutually assured destruction by achieving invulnerability, their own Yankee SSBNs had failed to do so. The solution was further escalation, developing missiles with even greater range to escape the JUK bottleneck, and developing the next generation of truly silent submarines that could mimic the ghost-like qualities of the American fleet. The silent laughter of the American subs had forced Moscow into a desperate, unending chase for acoustic parity. 1971, Charleston, South Carolina, and the SALT negotiations in Helsinki. As the 1970s began, the Soviet Union was finally achieving a quantitative parity with the U.S. in their land-based ICBMs, a fact that led to the opening of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. But the U.S. Navy was preparing a devastating qualitative leap that would once again shatter any notion of strategic balance. The introduction of a UGM-73 Poseidon C-3 missile. The Poseidon was a direct replacement for the Polaris A-3, but it was a technological revolution disguised in the same submarine tubes. Where the Polaris A-3 carried 3 non-independently targetable warheads, the Poseidon C-3 introduced true MIRVs, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. A single Poseidon missile could carry up to 14 separate, miniaturized nuclear warheads, each capable of being directed to a unique, geographically distinct target hundreds of miles apart. This was a quantum leap in lethality. The existing U.S. fleet of 31 SSBNs, the Lafayette, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin classes, when refitted with the Poseidon, could deploy an astonishing number of warheads. Consider the arithmetic. A single SSBN carried 16 missile tubes. $16 \text tubes \times 14 \text warheads / missile equals 224 \text warheads $. The entire fleet, when deployed, was capable of launching over 5,000 nuclear warheads from its invisible, submerged locations. This represented a 5-fold increase in destructive capability, all from a platform that the Soviets still could not reliably find. This capability fundamentally changed the nature of deterrence. Before Poseidon, the primary role of the Polaris SSBNs was counter-value targeting, destroying enemy cities and industrial centers, the second strike against the Soviet population. With the introduction of thousands of highly accurate, individually targetable warheads, the SSBNs could now be assigned counterforce missions, targeting hardened missile silos and deep command bunkers, targets previously reserved for the much larger, land-based Minuteman ICBMs. For the Soviet military, the news of the Poseidon deployment was an intelligence nightmare. Marshal Andrei Grechko, the Soviet Minister of Defense, received the assessment with barely controlled fury. "They have put a dozen swords where there was only one knife," he reportedly exclaimed. The fear was no longer simply retaliation. It was overkill coupled with first strike potential against fixed Soviet targets. Even if the Soviet Union launched a perfect first strike against every known U.S. silo and bomber base, the Poseidon fleet alone possessed enough warheads to completely destroy the Soviet state's military, political, and economic structure. This massive and instantaneous increase in U.S. nuclear delivery capability became the single greatest impediment to the SALT negotiations. The Soviet team insisted that the MIRV warheads be capped, arguing that the U.S. was leveraging an unfindable platform to achieve massive strategic superiority. The Americans, recognizing the immense political leverage provided by the SSBNs, were reluctant to negotiate away their greatest strength. In response, the Soviet Union redoubled its efforts. Engineers raced to develop their own MIRV technology for the land-based SS-18 ICBM and, more relevantly, for their newest SSBN platform, the Delta class, Project 667B. The Delta was designed to carry the massive, three-stage R-29 missile, which possessed the range, over 4,000 nautical miles, needed to strike the U.S. mainland from the safety of the heavily defended Soviet Arctic bastions. This was the ultimate necessity. The Soviets needed range to overcome their acoustic inferiority and escape the Jiayuke Gap. The Polaris/Poseidon revolution had forced the Soviet Navy to concede the open ocean and retreat to the sanctuary of their coastal waters, launching their missiles over the pole. The tiny, underestimated Polaris missile had evolved into the world's most terrifying mobile armory, ensuring that even at the negotiating table, the unseen threat beneath the waves held the ultimate veto power over the future of the Cold War. 1975, the Fleet Command Center, Pacific Fleet, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The greatest guarantor of the Polaris and Poseidon system's success was not the missile, but the absolute inability of the Soviet Navy to find the submarines. That invisibility was the result of a fanatical dedication to acoustic superiority and, as history would reveal, a devastating failure of Soviet internal security. By the mid-1970s, U.S. ASW forces had deployed the highly sensitive SOSUS sound surveillance system, a network of hydrophone arrays planted secretly on the ocean floor across the Atlantic and Pacific basins. SOSUS was designed to listen for the specific acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines transiting to open waters. It was the digital ear of the U.S. Navy. Yet, the Poseidon SSBNs were so quiet that they barely registered above the natural background noise on the same system. The Soviets, however, were still struggling. Despite their efforts with the Yankee and the newer, longer-range Delta classes, their shipbuilding technology and acoustic dampening techniques lagged dangerously behind. They were operating a noisy deterrent in a vast, loud ocean, making them targets for the American attack submarines, SSNs. This continuous, critical asymmetry forced the Soviet Union to expend enormous resources attempting to hunt the American boats. Their primary ASW assets, like the huge Cresta II and Kara-class cruisers, were constantly deployed, but their sonar systems were simply outclassed. Then, disaster struck the Soviet Navy from within. In 1975, the U.S. arrested Jerry Whitworth, who was part of the infamous Walker spy ring. The head of the ring, John A. Walker, Jr., was a chief warrant officer in the U.S. Navy, highly placed in communication security. For nearly 2 decades, Walker had been selling the Soviet Union some of the most sensitive naval secrets imaginable. The information Walker provided was a crippling blow to the viability of the Soviet deterrent. He gave the Kremlin the detailed operating instructions, cryptographic keys, and, most crucially, the vulnerability reports of the American Navy's communication systems. But most devastatingly for the Soviet admirals, he revealed the precise performance capabilities, frequency ranges, and acoustic targets of the American SOSUS network. Suddenly, the Soviet admirals understood exactly why their subs were being tracked. They learned which of their own boats were acoustically loudest, what frequencies to avoid, and where the ears of the American system were located. This intelligence was a gift and a curse. It validated their strategic fear. The Americans could find and track their Yankee and Delta boats, but also provided the roadmap to fixing their fleet. The revelation hit Admiral Gorshkov like a sledgehammer. The very essence of the Soviet Navy's strategic deployment was compromised. The long, silent transits of their SSBNs were essentially parades for the American SSNs. The Kremlin was furious, realizing they had been strategically vulnerable despite spending massive amounts on their naval assets. The Walker Ring betrayal accelerated the Soviet acoustic arms race. They immediately poured resources into their next generation of SSBNs, the Typhoon class, and their new attack submarines, the Akula class. These new boats were designed with a new knowledge in mind. They utilized advanced noise reduction technologies, massive rafting systems, and quieter propulsion plants, all aimed at achieving the same acoustic stealth that the Polaris boats had pioneered 20 years earlier. The Americans' initial strategic edge, the tiny Polaris sub-silence, had been leveraged so successfully that it forced the Soviet Union into a costly technological catch-up game that would last until the very end of the Cold War. The irony remained that the U.S. SSBNs themselves, the original goal of Soviet SW, continued to glide through the ocean utterly silent, regardless of what the Soviets knew about SOSUS. 1981. Severodvinsk Shipyard, Soviet Union and Bangor Base, Washington State, USA. The early 1980s marked the final decisive evolution of the undersea deterrent that Polaris had pioneered. If Polaris was a sharp dagger and Poseidon a cluster of knives, the Trident system was the sledgehammer of assured destruction. The Soviet Navy was still wrestling with the acoustic problems of their Yankee and Delta classes and struggling to build their massive, new, quiet Typhoons, a technological response to a 20-year-old American threat. But the United States was already deploying its next, overwhelming strategic masterpiece, the USS Ohio, SSBN 726, and the Trident IC for missile. The Ohio-class SSBNs were Leviathans, 560 feet long, displacing over 18,000 tons submerged. They were nearly twice the size of the original George Washington class, but thanks to advanced engineering and acoustic dampening, they were also orders of magnitude quieter than their predecessors and vastly quieter than any vessel the Soviet Union had produced. They were, in the words of naval analysts, the silent masters of the deep. The heart of this new deterrent was the missile itself. The UGM-96 Trident IC-4 was a solid-fueled rocket that boasted an astronomical range of over 4,000 nautical miles. This range was the ultimate strategic concession. It meant the Ohio SSBNs no longer needed to risk the long transits to patrol near the Soviet coastlines. Instead, the U.S. Navy could establish its own bastion areas, sanctuaries for its deterrent force, right off the continental U.S. coast. The Pacific Fleet of Ohio boats could patrol safely in the vast, deep, open water off Washington State and California, and still hold every major Soviet city, including Moscow, at risk. The Atlantic boats could operate deep in the Western Atlantic, thousands of miles from the JUK Gap and the concentrated Soviet ASW forces. For Admiral Gorshkov, now aging but still commanding the Soviet Navy, this was the final, crushing blow. He had spent 2 decades trying to find the Polaris boats operating in the Eastern Atlantic. Now, the new American deterrent had effectively made $90% of the world's oceans its patrol area. How could they possibly hunt a submarine that was so quiet it was nearly impossible to track and was operating effectively in its own backyard? The Ohio class also carried an unprecedented load, 24 missile tubes, each capable of carrying up to 8 MIRV warheads. A single Ohio-class SSBN could deliver $24 / 8 equals $192 warheads. The planned fleet of 18 Ohio boats would carry over 3,400 warheads, almost double the retaliatory power of the original 41 Polaris/Poseidon fleet, but deployed on fewer, quieter, and more robust vessels. The sheer scale of the Trident system's survivability meant the Americans had, in essence, won the strategic submarine arms race. They had an invincible second strike capability that was also becoming a credible first strike counterforce threat. The Soviet response, the enormous Typhoon-class SSBN, was an attempt to match the size and missile load, carrying 20 R-39 missiles. But the Typhoon, despite being revolutionary for the Soviets, was still noisier than the Ohio and was still constrained by having to launch its missiles from the Arctic bastions, a clear, predictable target zone. The cycle was complete. The Soviet admirals, who had once laughed at the tiny, limited-range Polaris missile, now faced a vessel so immense, so quiet, and so powerful that it made their entire strategic naval doctrine obsolete. The little sub had grown into the mighty Ohio, and its presence, unseen and unfindable, was the greatest guarantor of the terrifying peace known as mutually assured destruction. 1991. The Central Command Post, Russian Navy, Moscow. The Soviet Union was dissolving, its vast, centralized military infrastructure crumbling under economic strain and political upheaval. But deep beneath the surface of the world's oceans, the silent patrol continued, a chilling legacy of the Cold War's fiercest technological contest. The Soviet admirals, now grappling with the transition to the Russian Federation Navy, looked back at the strategic history of the Cold War and saw a single, clear inflection point. The moment the Polaris submarine achieved unassailable second strike status. That small, initial submarine, once dismissed, had forced the massive reallocation of Soviet resources, driven their strategic planners to Cuba, and ultimately resulted in a costly, decades-long naval arms race they could never truly win on acoustic grounds. In the command post, now less formal and much quieter than the tense war rooms of the 1960s, a retired Admiral Vasily Denisov, a former Yankee-class captain, reflected on the early intelligence reports. "We underestimated the technology, yes," he stated to a visiting historian. "We saw the tiny rocket, the limited range, and we saw our mighty ICBMs buried in the Urals. We felt safe. We did not understand that the real weapon was not the warhead, but the stealth. The Americans put their most important warheads on a mobile platform that could not be targeted. They had their guarantee. The guarantee was mad, mutually assured destruction. The Polaris SSBNs, by guaranteeing the destruction of the aggressor, removed the incentive for a first strike. They provided the stability that characterized the most terrifying decades of human history. They were the ultimate anti-war machine. By 1991, the U.S. had begun to phase out the original Polaris/Poseidon boats, replacing them entirely with the massive Ohio-class Trident vessels, which by now were being upgraded to the even longer range, more powerful Trident 2D5 missile. The D-5 had a range exceeding 7,000 miles and accuracy, so precise it made the subs a potent first-strike counterforce weapon against missile silos, further solidifying the American deterrent posture. The Russian Navy inherited the Delta and Typhoon fleets, powerful vessels, but still carrying the same inherent acoustic vulnerabilities relative to the U.S. fleet. The new Russian strategy, dictated by the economic reality, was to embrace the bastion concept that the American Trident system had perfected, keeping their SSBNs within the heavily defended waters of the Arctic, leveraging the long range of their missiles to hit U.S. targets over the pole, thus avoiding the deadly NATO ASW patrols in the open ocean. They had ultimately been forced to adopt a strategy dictated by the limitations the Polaris program had exposed 30 years prior. The original Polaris boats, the George Washington, Patrick Henry, and their sisters, were quietly retired, their mission complete. Their technological revolution had reshaped global strategy, forced the superpowers into a condition of perpetual technological paranoia, and paradoxically, ensured that the nuclear weapons they carried were never used. They achieved their greatest victory not in battle, but in the long, silent hours of their hidden patrols. They were the Cold War's ghosts, and their silence was its most powerful language.